the little house. In a great big wood, in a great big tree, there's the nicest little house that could possibly be. There's a tiny little knocker on the tiny little door, and a tiny little carpet on the tiny little floor. There's a tiny little table, and a tiny little bed, and a tiny little pillow for a tiny weeny head. A tiny little blanket, and a tiny little sheet, and a tiny water bottle, hot, for tiny little feet. A tiny little eiderdown, a tiny little chair, and a tiny little kettle for the owner when he's there. In a tiny little larder, there's a tiny thermos bottle for a tiny little greedy man who knows the woods of pottle. There's a tiny little peg for a tiny little hat, and a tiny little dog, and a tiny, tiny cat. If you've got a little house and you keep it spick and span, perhaps there'll come to live in it a tiny little man. You may not ever see him. He's extremely shy. But if you find a crumpled sheet or pins upon the window seat, or see the marks of tiny feet, you'll know the reason why.